Should a doctor prescribe poetry writing or visiting an art gallery as an alternative for medication? Medical professionals are doing so in a range of countries. The benefits of creative and community activity for health and well-being are increasingly being recognised globally. Could this be the case where Western medicine is catching up with practices First Nations communities have enacted for millennia? How are health and well-being impacted by creative art? The episode you're about to listen to was presented as part of the Poetry on Prescription Healing Through the Arts Symposium, a collaboration between the Centre for Creative and Cultural Research and the Health Research Institute at the University of Canberra. This two-day symposium brought together artists, health practitioners, and end users to learn more about the relationship between creative art and well-being, with a special focus on poetry. It was held at the University of Canberra over the 22nd and 23rd of November 2024.
Our final speaker for this session is Dr. Lachlan Brown. Dr. Lachlan Brown is a senior lecturer in English at Charles Sturt University, Wagga Wagga. He is the author of 2 books of poetry with Giramondo and has collaborated with artists including Tony Curran, James Farley, Christine Reid and Juanita McLaughlin. His commissioned works include a poetic biographical portrait for Memory Book, Portraits of Older Australians, edited by Cassandra Atherton and Jessica Wilkinson. Poetry about running about the Parramatta River for the River Project, commissioned by the Powerhouse Museum. And poetry about COVID-19, daily walks for the ABC every day. Lachlan's poems have been shortlisted for prizes including the Blake Poetry Prize, the Gwen Harwood Poetry Prize, the Peter Porter Poetry Prize, and the University of Canberra's Vice-Chancellor's International Poetry Prize. Lachlan.
Hi everyone. When Paul emailed me a few days ago saying, can you come and speak, fill in at the Poetry and Health Conference, I thought this is a very strange moment because I just got this email from a friend, or no, actually not from a friend, from a random guy called The Dude from Perth, who said, I've just listened to a poetry reading you gave, which is online, and I want to put it on my radio show. That poetry reading was recorded in the KFC car park in Wagga Wagga of me reading a poem, and I got interrupted by someone wanting to know what I was doing. So I thought it was a very strange thing for me to be speaking about poetry and health as I was getting emailed about my Zinger box, and But I'm glad to be here. It feels, particularly this time of the day as well, feels like I'm a substitute teacher. You know, those ones that get asked on the day to kind of come and teach this class. So I'm prepared for you to tell me names that are not your name, or to leave, or to heckle. And I know a little bit about the thing that I'm going to be talking about. One thing I'm not going to do. Well, one thing I am going to do that a substitute teacher should not do is I'm going to expose myself. And in that, particularly after the last interaction between Bridget and Paul, I've got to expose myself by speaking about some poetic responses that I've made to works by Vic McEwan, who's our keynote speaker later on. And I'm going to kind of... It's a bit disingenuous because... this is me looking back at how I made these things and trying to make sense of how I made these things and what they might show and how poetically they may or may not work. So I'm going to take you through that, but this is like now me looking back at old me, trying to work out what old me was doing. And if I make mistakes, Vic said he's going to yell out and tell me what's right or wrong. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how I came to sort of do this stuff with Vic McEwan's work, and I'm going to take you through. This is a bit like an overture to the keynote, I guess. Prelude. So it started when a guy named Scott Howie asked me to be the poet in residence for Art State 2020, and that was a kind of, you had to kind of go around to all these art exhibitions. Art State's now defunct because the government defunded it. But it was a big regional arts festival that was held in New South Wales. And as poet in residence, Scott said you must go to Vic McEwan's exhibition called Sigh. It was a remarkable experience. We got a bus out there. The bus broke down, and it involved blacksmithing by John Wood. It involved organs and hydrophonic microphones in water. Incredible experience. At the end of it, there was a puff. You can see the sigh there. So they'd made a link of a chain. Yeah. Got my fist. Yeah. Otherwise, the fist will come at me if I don't. Yeah. Two fists. Right. Yeah. Okay. So you can see the sigh coming out there of the. And so my response was thinking poetically about this moment to come up with this weird form called a haiku, which was trying to get at this sense of what this moment had meant, and the extra syllable at the end of the haiku being a kind of cosmological moment of kind of speech that was no speech, that was kind of this sound that had come, because the performance was often about sound. And if you know anything about Vic McEwan's work, you will know that he's very concerned and generous in thinking about his audience. So he's an artist of many kind of media, but there is often this concern about, well, how do people interact with this work? This is not just me throwing a work at the world, but thinking about ethically and about how that work is received. And so when Vic was doing his PhD work, he was working with the Sydney Facial Nerve Clinic at the University of Sydney, and he sent me an email saying, these are how these things happen. We're gonna have this event. We're gonna expand my exhibition, and I want you to encounter these works, or people to encounter them, but actually want people to encounter these performances where other artists have encountered my works, and I want to show you a couple of them. I think what this is, the background to this is a kind of this sense as a poet that you're coming to an event or an artwork prepared for an encounter. You're thinking about response, but also you're attuned to the performance of that response. Weird thing was that it never happened, right? Because I think someone got ill, and then Wagga had this event, like touch football competition weekend, and so everyone like put the prices up of to stay in Wagga, and it was like $1,000 to stay for a night. So we couldn't have the event because no one could come to Wagga because of all the touch football people. But we did some recordings of these poetic and other responses. So there's different artists, Nat Power and others, responding in different art forms to these artworks. So I want to take you through how, as a poet, I kind of thought through that. Here's one of the artworks. I'll just go back and forward. So this is Penelope Grist's description of this artwork, The Face That Your Face Feels. On approach, the immediate visual parallels flash my mind. Albert Tucker's Cubist series of cratered heads, Francis Bacon's blurred, distorted portraits. These portraits clearly didn't depict altered perception or psychological states, but instead told a story of closeness. McEwan projected photographic portraits of patients' faces onto the hands of Dr. Susan Coulson, one of their treating clinicians, and rephotographed them. At a distance, the faces were more distinct. Up close, it was the creases, lines and shapes of the fingers that dominated. So you can see that there. And if you got closer, you could see, and I think I've got maybe another one there. There's the... So the poetic response that I sort of was thinking through, and this is where now I'm terrified of like being a pretentious kind of narcissistic... Terry Eagleton is not here, so that is a good thing. But as a poet, you think how to connect. What does this encounter look like? And so I hate villanelles, so I said I'll make a villanelle because I was thinking about this idea of being face to face with something. and Eliot's line, in Proof Rock, there'll be a time to prepare a face to meet the faces that you meet. And this is a failed villanelle because, this line about face to hand, hand to face, where we're thinking about proximity, how a face might be on a hand, how a hand might have a face on it, and how those little, it's interesting after the last paper, how those little words, those kind of like two, can take on such an interesting sort of array of meanings. And so I was taking up, I guess, T.S. Eliot's All the Works and Days of Hands, which is a kind of very famous line from, and it's kind of harking back to Hesiod's Works and Days, the agricultural sort of Greek poem. But it's a failed villanelle, of course, because the lines face to hand, hand to face, they kind of morph as you go through. So in the fourth stanza, from face to face to face to face, as you're going along the line. Fifth, from face to hand, and hand to face to face. So thinking about what this portrait means. So that's sort of one moment I'm just going to talk about. And I chose the villanelle form because of this. There's this incantation, a sense of incantation here in the villanelle, in that repetition that something's being summoned. And I think in the presence of that artwork, you do feel like something has been summoned here, something that was not here before in these incredible, like wonderful, wonderful portraits. So you hear perhaps Vic talk about them later. We'll talk about this one in a little bit more detail. There's my photo of going to see this artwork at Wagga Wagga Art Gallery. It's called The Unravelling, and it's an unravelled French horn with audio playing through it. You can see the little chord at the bottom there. It was based on someone at the facial nerve clinic named Liz C. And she had, before she'd gone in for surgery, she'd been a French horn player. So I'll just read, in 2020, Liz had a head and neck tumour removed, which required cutting the facial nerve. The resulting permanent paralysis prevents her playing the French horn. As she missed her musical life and playing in an orchestra, she took up the cello as a complete beginner. Liz reflected on the artwork. So for me, hearing the cello being played through the horn, so what Vic did was took a recording of her playing the cello and put it through the French horn, so you could listen at the bell, you could listen into this French horn. It was a very haunting cello coming out of it. And it was the cello of someone who could no longer play the French horn because of the changes to her embouchure. You can see some pictures here of the installation. So this is from Vic's PhD thesis. And then this is the unravelling of that French horn. They're very tightly wound instruments, and so to get them unwound is a huge sort of undertaking. There's an intricacy involved. And so there are things that Vic was able to do in his interviews with Liz that the clinicians may not have been able to do and in this artwork. And there's a really moving account in the PhD of her response to this when she came and heard it and saw it. So yeah, that's an installation picture of it being installed. My response to this was I was really drawn by this artwork for a couple of reasons. The first reason was that I used to play the French horn when I was little. That's me on the left, that's my son on the right. So French horn is part of my background, but when I moved to Wagga in 2011, I kind of played it once. I played Beethoven's septet with some friends for one of their birthdays, and then I haven't touched it, right? So for 13 years, I haven't played this instrument that formed a big part of my life. It was in lots of orchestras in Sydney, fewer opportunities perhaps in regional Australia. But this struck me because my teacher, when I was in Sydney, and he'd be very, very embarrassed by this, his name was Campbell Barnes, and he is a really interesting figure in the Australian and international horn scene because he's a farmer in Mudgee, I think, but he got a scholarship to study overseas and he became a European orchestral player. So he played in the Zurich Orchestra and others. But then he got a stroke. And his professional career was kind of over. He had to return to Australia, and he retaught himself to play the things that he had taken for granted as kind of individual sort of, I just learned how to play. He needed to build up muscle by muscle, part by part, which made him the guru of the French horn at Sydney Conservatorium because he knew how to teach. He'd done it once, and then he'd had to climb up that mountain again, but really knowing every little part. And so you'll see in lots of professional French horn players, Campbell Barnes will be one of their teachers. He's this absolute guru of the Australian French horn scene. And so when I was trying to think about just why this artwork struck me in particular, I came up. I wanted to speak a little bit about this poem. It's kind of there's a few things about it. I titled it Listening In because this idea of listening in, and I was listening to a song at that time by Becca Stevens and jazz pianist Taylor Eichste. And again, there's those prepositional turns to listen up, to listen in. It's kind of an existential moment in this song. I don't think we'll play it now, but you can have a listen later on. And I was thinking as well of the Kenneth Koch poem, very famous poem, One Train May Hide Another, which is kind of a sign at a railroad crossing in Kenya. And one of my PhD students, Connor Waitman, put me onto this poem. But it begins in a poem, one line may hide another, as at a crossing, one train may hide another. So in this poem, what I was trying to do is think about what can be embedded, what is within. So what is within this French horn? The Koch poem ends to have waited at least a moment to see what was already there. These ideas of nesting and one within another were there a little bit. The other thing that I was thinking about putting this thing together was this idea of form and why it is that a Petrarchan sonnet came out. I think it's because, you can see that that's called the small song, so sonnet is a little song, and so what we've got here on the wall is the French horn playing this little song, scraped from old memories and a new technique. There's this idea that the sonnet is kind of the birth of modern thought or the birth of a type of interiority that we hadn't kind of seen before. Now, I'm not sure if I totally agree, but I thought that was really resonant to use a sonnet this way. And Petrarchan sonnets are interesting because you've got like one rhyme in the first, one rhyme in the first octave, and then kind of you kind of stumble over the end, kind of gets wound up a little because of the ways that the CDE rhyme works. And it felt to me like a ravelling and unravelling, this idea of the horn being ravelled and unravelling. I kind of delayed my Volta a little bit, kind of had this extra breath there. I also thought about this idea of the, when you learn the French horn, they make you play these like unaccompanied cello suites, but on the French horn. And this is a little bit dark, but there's something in this poem I think about that is about mortality or the outside. And I did my PhD on Kevin Hart's poetry, and really this notion that within the grammar or within language, there's this pointing to an outside. Blanchot calls the outside where there is no intimacy, no place to rest, or to the outside which knows no intimacy or limit. And so there's part of the moving thing about this artwork and that I'm trying to get at this poem is that kind of sense of mortality. I might finish there. I think there's I think we'll just finish it at that one. Is that all right? And then I've got another one, but maybe I'll just finish by reading it.
You have 3
Oh, 3 minutes. Oh, heaps of time. So I'll read this one and then maybe talk a little bit about the last one. Listening in a poem, one line may hide another line, Kenneth Koch. Small song scraped from old memories and new technique, unwinding second breath along a length of brass, not quite death's tune, not yet at least, only these peripheries of sound, a wandering undertow that sees what we must become, the hard-pressed embouchure replaced by bow and string, suggesting one song may hide another. One breeze contains more than its allotted movement of air. Ear to bell, you can hear the distance the nearer you get. The enclosure uncoils, cello in horn, horn in room, room in gallery, gallery a prayer that must be double-faced, addressing both hearer and maker, the unaccompanied company, the song reborn. Maybe the third poem that I wanted to talk about was Vic McEwan has an artwork called The Crying Room, in which you can see it there, an elaborate combination of water, electronics, valves, projectors and chime bars. So the electronics would have tears coming down, triggering, and then at the exact moment that the digital tear would reach the edge, an actual drop of water would drop onto a chime, so an analog chime. And so there's a series of these. And so the final poem, I'll just play it for you, I guess, if that's all right, is an Elizabethanish sonnet that interacts with this, and I might finish with this one. Histrionic repetition. Someone's crying, Lord. Someone's missing out on the future. Someone's flatlining. Someone's preparing a speech and kissing the lipsticky present. Someone's stock is declining. Someone forgot to even participate. Someone laughs with Shiraz-stained teeth. Someone spills the wrong colour under the table again. Someone places a wreath, and within 30 seconds it's covered in offensive slogans. Someone chants alone. Someone has to be the burnt offering after placing fake sirens in every home. Someone questions the function of art. Someone discovers a tiny beating heart. So when Bridget was talking earlier about kind of the pretentious nature of poetry, sort of, 90% of Wagga would say that is it right there. But in my experience, that generosity of the artist calling us into the artwork to respond as poets and to draw out those affordances of poetry in its nature and in its performance and in its breadth, I think open up more spaces. And I think that's one of the things that makes Vic McEwan such an important artist in New South Wales and in the world, I think. So, yeah, over to him later on. Yeah, thanks everyone.
That was so powerful. Oh my God. Angela again. When I write, I don't even think about the style or the type of poem. I just write and whatever comes out, comes out. I'm not a professional poet. How do you decide on the stylistic, is that what you call it, of a poem? Like, you're responding to an artwork and then you're deciding on how to write. Is there a process for you, or?
Sometimes there is. I play piano in a jazz band, and so sometimes it's a bit, you do all your scales and you do your practice and you learn all your parts, and then you've really got to be focused in a moment to deliver and to improvise. But then poetry is a little different because you have the ability to sculpt and go over. And I think in the last session, one of the interesting things is this kind of idea of labour, the labour of creative writing, where you might go over and you might think and you might work hard, and what that means for health writing, in which often the therapeutic moment, and this happens in writing workshops, right? Often people will say, well, it just became like a session where everyone talked about their grievances and what they're upset about, and no one actually got better at poetry because we're all too scared to kind of critique one another. I was in a group that became Sweatshop when it first started in Western Sydney, where I grew up, and it's a bit pugilistic. Like, people would just attack one, like fight. It's like being in a boxing ring, but for and Luke Carman and Peter Pilates and Muhammad Ahmed would just like go at you. But that kind of teaches you that craft can be important, and so in those artworks, you're responding in ways that kind of it's that sonnet as a mode of thinking, and is this moment something? What does this encounter look like? And that's why poetry is so good, because it can sustain, it can hold all these many things, which is why the moment of close reading is such an important moment, right? Because then we start to sort of unpack them and sort of see what do we bring to this, what is in here. And so, it will be different for different works, I think. I should record myself writing and see, I guess. Thanks, Angela.
Hi, it's Kelly Swain again. Forgive me somewhat. I'm fairly new to Australian academia, so even though I moved here about 4 years ago, I've had a little daughter, and so I've really just started getting my head around what I'm kind of interested in: territorialization and deterritorialization, and writing a lot within medical humanities, which I've noticed they don't even really call it that here. It's usually called art and health. So just correct me, everyone. I'm getting lost in translation somewhat, but doing a lot of work in the field in the UK, often possibly because of just the density of people. When I've been called in as a poet, it's because of my specialization in history of medicine or medical humanities, but I'm just really interested in how you came to be involved as a poet or invited as a poet. I'm really interested to hear more from Vic. I don't know his work, but from my context, that kind of work would fall under medical humanities. And I wonder if he's kind of considers himself that, or if it's just under the banner of arts. If your work is more medical and body focused, or if you're kind of a poet, more broadly speaking. Are you in the Faculty of Literature? I'm just kind of really interested in mapping out the lay of the land, I guess.
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. Vic can speak to his project at the University of Sydney, which is unique, which is kind of groundbreaking in a sense. I mean, University of Sydney also has the Perkins Centre, which has a very large writing fellowship, very prestigious writing fellowship, but that's sort of health related as well. And because I'm at a regional university, we don't have the luxury of kind of turning things down or narrowly defining ourselves. You just go where you can go and do what you can do. The one thing about so the humanities, so I teach in the literature program, creative writing, but one thing about the regions is that you're licensed, I think, to kind of to get outside those boxes a little, because you're kind of living near the people. You're running into them down the street sometimes. I mean, Vic's in CAD Factory's in Narrandera, an hour and a half away. But the other day I thought about the kinds of great artists that are in Wagga at the moment, all doing incredible work. And we do go to the same kind of hospitals and doctors and spaces, so they're less formalised. They're kind of regionally inflected in that sense, but they're always precarious in that it's to do with these filaments, these threads of connection, rather than like because no one's supporting you really. to do this. So you're just kind of finding your way a bit. But it's different in the cities. So the cities more established. Yeah.
Hey, thanks, Lachlan. I really enjoyed that. It's great. I've got a question that's a bit inchoate, but it's about faces and literature. You know, like, so with quite a lot of Vic's work there's an actual, an iconic representation of a face. When you're writing, a phrase I once saw was losing my face while reading Finnegan's Wake. You know, and there's
Off
a
your
way
face,
where, when you get immersed in a novel or whatever, you know, having a face, not having a face kind of disappears in a way. And I'm just wondering how you grappled with ideas of face when, you know.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, if you read Vic's PhD, there's a kind of ethical attunement there to interviewing the people and being involved in their treatment in particular ways, and he'll potentially speak more about that in his. So it's not as if they're kind of anonymous or faceless. There's a kind of deeply engaged ethical process. And I think in the background there is kind of this Levinasian sort of notions of alterity and how they work this kind of infinite nature of the other. And that's why I was trying to bring up Blanchot a little. Blanchot's a bit darker than Levinas in that sense. But there is that at once you're sort of there is connection and no connection. There is a face that is not a face. There's something here that kind of exceeds the bounds, and so maybe in this it's all a bit gnomic and paradoxical in that sense. But being physically in the space of Wagga Wagga Art Gallery, seeing these artworks, so you're facing these faces as a poet and as a kind of interlocutor with this exhibition, but those faces are themselves projected onto hands, and the hands have themselves rearranged or the nerves in those faces, and so you're starting to sort of nest these concepts, and they become a little kind of mise en abîme like, or nested, or even dialectic maybe, oscillations. So a face is never a face. There's always, something else going on.
I don't know if I'm very good at being quick. Hi, Lachlan, it's Roxanne
Roxy.
here. Really interested in that presentation. You weren't at all pretentious. To me, it showed a great caring, not just for the language, but for the integrity of the artwork and of the artist. So there was that relating on so many different levels, and you've spoken to some of the ethics of that. I'm wondering about where that comes from on the other side as well, so how the artists have responded to your response to their artwork.
Yeah, I don't know, Vic, what do you reckon? He's there.
Thanks very much. I initially made that invitation to Lachlan after he sent me his poem from the show Sigh that we made. And really because, I sensed in that poem that in reading his words, he was kind of making me feel an emotional quality that was present for me as a performer in the making of Sigh. So not articulated, but I felt it. And so when I was just thinking when I was revisiting all of this just now with you all, that, what I was struck by just then was when I spent my time in the facial nerve clinic, which I'll speak about next, there's all of that unspoken stuff that doesn't happen in a medical clinic. The psychological aspect, for example, of especially if you have facial paralysis. And when I was listening to this today, what it made me feel was that Lachlan was sort of making me again feel a similar thing that I felt in the clinic around the unspokenness, the things that there aren't time for within the medical encounter in the clinic. And so I think it was, again, his words, I was concentrating less on the words and the feeling that I was experiencing from experiencing his work, and it spoke to the medical journey of those patients for me.